Hi, everyone. Welcome. If you're here for Trade Justice's May Trade Justice Power Hour on the labor rights, environmental, and Indigenous rights implications of critical minerals agreements, you are in the right place. We're going to give folks just a second to trickle into the Zoom, and then we'll get started. You should feel free to put your name, your pronouns, where you're calling in from, that kind of thing in the chat. And we're going to get started in just a second. Welcome again to folks that are just joining us. If you're here for our May Trade Justice Power Hour on the labor, environment, and Indigenous rights implications of critical minerals agreements, you're in the right place. We are going to give folks a second to trickle into the Zoom, and then we will get started. So please feel free to put your name, your pronouns, where you're calling in from, that kind of thing in the chat. And we will get started here in just a minute. Hi again to folks that are just joining us. If you're here for our May Trade Justice Power Hour, you're in the right place. We're giving folks just a second to trickle into the Zoom. Please feel free to put your name, pronouns, and where you're calling in from in the chat. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. For folks who don't know me, I'm Hillary Hayden. I'm the organizing director for the Trade Justice Education Fund. We're a national nonprofit working to stop the damage of corporate-centered trade deals and promote a positive vision for international trade. These Trade Justice Power Hour calls happen every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, and they cover a wide range of educational topics about trade policy that are relevant and interesting to activists across the country. I do want to flag that these calls are not intended as press briefings. So if you're a member of the press and you have questions, I am more than happy to talk to you separately, but this is not the place for those questions. This month, we're going to be focusing on a relatively new area of climate-related work for trade activists. A lot of folks that attend these calls regularly are familiar with all our calls toward ending investor-state dispute settlement and with work toward enacting a climate peace clause. But another piece of the puzzle at the intersection of trade and climate really centers around the procurement of critical minerals like lithium, nickel, copper, and cobalt that are needed for green technologies. In recent months, the Biden administration has shown an interest in negotiating a series of critical minerals agreements. The acronym is CMAs, which you're probably going to be hearing a lot on this call, with countries that are involved in the mining and processing supply chains of critical minerals. Depending on how they're written, these targeted trade deals could either help meet climate and job creation and sustainable development goals, or accelerate exploitative models of resource extraction that have been devastating for workers, communities, and the environment. So by way of an agenda for today, first, we're going to hear from Krista Shennum of Climate Rights International, who's going to give us some background on the community impact of mining and mineral processing operations by summarizing a new report on the environmental, indigenous rights, and labor implications of massive new nickel mining operations in Indonesia. Then we're going to hear from Trade Justice's Executive Director, Arthur Stamoulis, who will give us some background on critical minerals agreements, including what's at stake and how we can help to shape them. And then after Arthur's comments, we'll have time to take questions. So please, as we're going, if you have questions that come up, please put them in the Q&A feature, and then we will get to those after Krista and Arthur's comments. And then lastly, toward the end of the call, I'm going to share a couple things that folks can do to help make a difference on this issue in the coming weeks. I think with that, I'm going to hand it off to our first speaker. Krista, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many people here today. Really nice to be with you all. My name is Krista Shennum. I'm a researcher at Climate Rights International. We're a fairly new organization, just started. Our purpose is to document human rights abuses related to either the drivers of the climate crisis or the ways that the climate crisis impacts human rights. So as Hillary just mentioned, we released a report back in January that we worked on for about a year. I'll put it in the chat after I kind of give an overview, but this report really focuses on the ways that nickel mining and smelting in Indonesia impacts human rights, the environment, and the climate. Just for a bit of context and why you should care about this and why we would write a report like this on Indonesia, is that Indonesia currently produces over half of the world's nickel. The kind of preliminary numbers for 2023 is that it produced roughly 55% of the world's nickel. It's been a huge growth in recent years too. So we're largely seeing this growth in nickel demand, largely driven by electric vehicles and other renewable energy technologies. So we're seeing a huge growth. So we wrote this report. The way that we do work is we document human rights abuses based on first-person accounts. So together with my colleague Adi Rinaldi, who's based in Jakarta. We visited local communities, many times to, interview people on how, the nickel industry was impacting them. So our report focuses on one large industrial park in Indonesia. It's called the Indonesia Weda Bay Industrial Park, or it's called EWIP is the acronym. Essentially, what's happening in Indonesia is that a couple years ago, the government had banned the export of raw nickel ore. So it attempts to kind of build up the domestic economy, not just as a resource exporter, but also processing the nickel. So it's a higher investment product. So what that means is that we're seeing really large industrial parks like EWIP starting across the country. So EWIP, where it is, it's in a region in East Indonesia called North Maluku. It's on the island of Halmahera. So for context, it's about an 8-hour trip from Jakarta, the capital. It's a really long journey. It's a 4-hour plane ride, a boat ride, a long journey. So just where it is very far away from where politicians, businesses, decision makers are headquartered. This industrial park is about 5,000 hectares. It's massive. It was proposed in 2018 and started less than 2 years later in 2020. So you can imagine, this really fast process of building an $11 billion industrial park, happened very quickly without a lot of public input. So just to kind of highlight some of the findings in our report and then kind of connect it back to electric vehicle companies a little bit more at the end. But the main ways that this is impacting people is it's threatening human rights. It's having significant impacts on people's rights. It's contributing to significant environmental pollution, and perversely, it's also contributing to the climate crisis. So kind of starting with these human rights elements, one of the main ways that people described how it impacts them is through the process of land acquisition. So we spoke with many people who told us that their land has been taken by companies with no compensation. So this is even cases where people have, the legal title, the land certificate to their land, and it was taken by companies and destroyed without any compensation. In other cases, companies have taken people's lands, destroyed it, and then compensated them later, giving people essentially no opportunity but to sell their lands because the trees, the forest agricultural products like nutmeg and coconuts that they were dependent on for their livelihoods have been destroyed. In almost every single case, people were not able to negotiate the price of the land. So they were offered, a really low price, something like the cost of a packet of instant noodles per square meter, and a really take it or leave it scheme. In instances where people did not want to sell their land, they often experienced intimidation by police or military personnel working on behalf of companies. So for example, we spoke with one man who told me that at 2 a.m, he would have visits to his door from police officers to demand why he hadn't sold his land. So really threatening people in really significant ways. I spoke kind of a little bit about, where in Indonesia this is. It's very remote, and thinking about who are the people who are living there. So you have many coastal communities and also many indigenous peoples. The government of Indonesia has largely failed to fully recognize indigenous peoples and their customary lands. So there's been, for 11 years, a Indigenous Peoples' Rights Bill that has not been passed that would, help recognize people. But because of this, there's been a significant amount of conflict between Indigenous peoples and mining and smelting companies. Out of the couple dozen people we interviewed, not a single person was able to exercise their right to free, prior, informed consent, which is the kind of international best practice standard around Indigenous people's rights when you're talking about development projects, that Indigenous peoples have a right to free, prior, informed consent, or FPIC, if you see that acronym. We're also seeing very significant impacts on people's traditional livelihoods. So people that have been fishing or farming for generations are no longer able to do so. So for example, I spoke with a woman who would catch fish right off the shore for decades, and now is no longer able to do so because industrial pollution in the bay is now killing the fish, killing the corals. There's no longer fish to catch. The environmental pollution from these projects is really significant, and it's not only just impacting the environment but also people's rights. And there are entire communities that no longer have safe, clean drinking water. That there's very little access to information as well about what is clean and what is not in terms of air and water quality. And this is despite there being, legal regulations that companies should be monitoring air and water quality, and the government should be providing that information. In reality, that's not happening. So, people are deciding, do I drink this water or not based on the color? That's not actually giving people information if, they're drinking water that's exposed, has heavy metals. Nickel is toxic to humans as well. So if there's nickel in the water, people don't know that. People are also extremely concerned that newly developed health impacts, including, trouble breathing, respiratory illnesses, skin ailments, are connected to heavy pollution from industrial activities. So really, one of the things that's been really profound about this work, beyond, these very significant health impacts is, we do need, of course, critical minerals for electric vehicles. Like, we believe that they're part of the energy transition, but the way that, nickel is currently being mined and processed in Indonesia is not necessarily a climate solution. There's been significant amounts of deforestation. So we did some, geospatial analysis to find that thousands of hectares have already been cut within mining concessions. This is because in Indonesia and in other tropical countries, nickel is located very close to the surface of the earth, so it requires open pit mining. So the destruction of, primary forests. And also, really alarmingly, there's been a massive build out of brand new coal plants to power this industry. So at the EWIP Industrial Park alone, once it's fully operational, it'll be home to 12 brand new captive coal-fired power plants that otherwise would not exist. So captive coal plants are coal plants that directly power industrial activities. They're not, feeding into the grid. So they're not providing electricity to, local communities. So those communities are feeling the full, brunt of the impacts of that air pollution, but they're not receiving any of the benefits of, that reliable electricity. And so, this is, at this one industrial park, like I said, 12 coal plants totaling 3.7 gigawatts of coal capacity. So just for comparison, that's roughly the amount of coal burned in Spain or Brazil in a year. And that's just how it's one industrial park. Across Indonesia, there's roughly 14 gigawatts of coal capacity, just captive coal capacity, and that's largely powering nickel industry. By the end of this decade, it might rise up to 30 gigawatts. So this is just an astounding amount of emissions. There hasn't been essentially any assessment by the industry of if they can power, these plants with renewables. Yet we know that in other parts of the world, including in Australia, nickel smelting operations are powered through renewables, including solar. So this is just, a really key piece. So thinking about, who are the companies involved, what the industrial park itself is a joint venture of 3 Chinese companies. One of them is publicly listed in China, and the other two are privately held. Within the industrial park, though, there are many, many other companies that are operating that, are smelting and refining nickel, including battery grade nickel. So we have, South Korean, Australian, European, Chinese, Indonesian companies that are all, operating within this industrial park. One of the other things that we were able to do with our research is kind of track the supply chains of specific electric vehicle companies. So through this, we know that Tesla, Volkswagen, and Ford have agreements to buy nickel from Indonesia, including from companies that have operations at the EWIP industrial park. And that said, like I started out with, over half of the world's nickel is coming from Indonesia. So it is very likely that many other electric vehicle companies are sourcing nickel from Indonesia, including from places where these harms are happening. So maybe I'll pause there. Happy to answer any questions folks have. And then maybe before I turn it back to you, Hillary, just a note on the kind of Indonesia-US trade agreement. So back in November, President Jokowi was visiting the US and had a visit with Biden. It was really the #1 agenda item for that meeting was, discussing a critical minerals agreement between Indonesia and the US. I think we'll get into this a little bit more, but the purpose of these CMAs is to enable, other countries to qualify for tax credits through the IRA. So, as this global, supplier of nickel, Indonesia is interested in that. So happy to, answer questions about that as well.
Krista, I want to thank you so much. I've heard you speak one other time on a call, and I just think you do such a good job of framing this issue and driving home why so many of these conversations are so important for clean energy transitions, that kind of thing. Thank you so much, and we'll hold on for Q&A. Arthur, are you ready to talk about CMAs?
I am. And thank you, Hillary. It's great to be with everyone here. And let me echo the thank you to Krista. That was just an extremely helpful overview of a lot of the issues at stake when we talk about critical minerals mining. Let me just quickly share my screen. And Hillary, tell me if this doesn't work properly. I'm going to assume it is working
Great.
properly, unless I hear otherwise. Yep, thank you. I'm going to take the next 12 minutes or so to talk about, whoops, that might have been a mistake. I'm going to take the next 12 minutes or so to talk about first, why Trade Justice Education Fund is working on this issue, like what makes this a trade issue. And second, what specifically we're advocating for so that any new critical minerals agreements advance the creation of just and sustainable supply chains. So just to start real quick, what are critical minerals? I think a good layperson's definition of critical minerals would be like the raw materials that are needed for clean energy technologies, but that aren't that easy to get a hold of. And that list isn't a constant. It actually changes based on what minerals are most needed by the energy sector at any given time, how readily available those minerals are. But today, the list includes things like nickel, cobalt, lithium, and a bunch of others listed here on your screen. And a lot of these materials, as we heard, are used in electric vehicles, long storage batteries, solar panels, and other green technologies. And so as the US and other global north countries increasingly transition away from burning fossil fuels for energy towards using renewable sources, the demand for these technologies and thus for critical minerals is likely to increase. At the same time as developing countries increasingly develop, with more people getting access, sometimes for the first time, to reliable electricity, home heating and cooling, personal vehicles, and so on, the demand for critical minerals will also increase globally. So it makes sense that the United States and the world are starting to ask the question, how are we going to get a hold of these minerals? And because these minerals are located all over the world, it also makes sense that we're starting to see trade negotiators pulled into this question. So in theory, critical minerals agreements are a type of narrowly focused trade deal that's designed to diversify and strengthen critical mineral supply chains, right? They're supposed to help us access new critical mineral sources. But in reality, critical minerals agreements took off first as a concept not to diversify our supply chains, but instead as an attempt to appease countries that were threatening trade attacks against the electric vehicle tax credits within the Inflation Reduction Act. So the first CMA that was negotiated, the US-Japan Critical Minerals Agreement late last year, did nothing to expand critical mineral supply chains. Instead, it was all about giving Japanese products greater access to US tax credits so that Japan wouldn't launch a WTO suit against us. And I can go into the wonky backstory and all this during the Q&A if people are interested. It's actually a great case study for why a climate peace clause is needed. But I raise it today as context to explain that, the actual contents of the first CMA discussions were pretty much an afterthought, like shaping the rules of the pact in a way that works for people, that works for the planet, was not the priority. The priority was just avoiding WTO trade attacks. And so when we flash forward to today, as Hillary already said, we're at this crossroads on the issue. Should there be new CMAs, and my guess is there probably will be, like the rules written into these CMAs can either prioritize advancing shared climate, job creation, sustainable development, other goals across borders, or the rules can reinforce and accelerate the type of highly exploitative neo-colonial models of resource extraction that have been extremely damaging to affected communities, to the environment, and to international relations. Obviously, we at Trade Justice want to do the former, avoid the latter. We do not want CMAs to help enrich big corporations while screwing over the communities the minerals come from, destroying biodiversity, accelerating a race to the bottom in workplace standards, fracturing the fragile political coalitions that are needed to address climate change in a serious way, both domestically and internationally. Instead, we want resilient critical mineral supply chains that meet energy transition needs while also creating good paying jobs and advancing sustainable development for people at home and abroad. So that is the background. What are we actually advocating for in critical minerals agreements to help us achieve that? So last month, Trade Justice submitted official comments on this subject to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. They were developed in partnership with environmental, faith, fair trade, other organizations across the US and around the world, many of whom have been on the front lines of these issues, like Climate Rights International, Krista's group. And our recommendations on how to ensure that critical mineral supply chains become more just and sustainable, focused on 5 major areas. So the first was we said any agreement needs to take critical mineral circularity very seriously. What does that mean? It means before the US starts investing in or otherwise incentivizing new mining operations, let's make sure we're also investing in reduce, reuse, recycle systems and technologies. We understand that new mining will be needed, but our strategy can't all be about new mining. We need to study how we can be reducing the need for critical minerals more, and then we need to be studying how we can refurbish, reuse, recycle critical minerals better. And then we need to take those lessons, incorporate those ideas into any critical minerals agreements too. Again, not just mining, we need the whole circle here. And this, by the way, is extremely consistent with an existing executive order from President Biden on promoting resource circularity and clean energy technologies. The trick is now to just apply the demands of that executive order because that first CMA with Japan did not do that. Second, any new CMA needs to promote sustainable development and quality job creation. We, of course, want sustainable development of value chain industries for workers in the US, but we also want them for people in areas from which critical minerals are being extracted or recovered. What we don't want is more of this rip and ship resource extraction in which minerals are ripped from the ground in one country, then shipped to some second country with weak labor and environmental standards for sweatshop style processing and manufacturing. And then finally, the finished product shipped back for sale in the US, undercutting local producers. We need measures to prevent that. Things like fair royalty standards, local content standards, strong rules of origin, an end to investor state dispute settlement. All of those will help, as will additional standards on labor and the environment. I'll talk about in a second. And insofar as any agreement is between the US and global South countries, there need to be concrete commitments of financial, technical, other assistance to ensure that the communities and regions from which the minerals are being mined or recovered are getting their own development goals met. Like this can't be a one-way street. People throughout these supply chains need to be benefiting from them. Third, any new CMA needs to obligate countries to ensure that strong standards are being met throughout the supply chain in a number of areas. We focused on the need for standards to ensure the free, prior, and informed consent of impacted communities, including both Indigenous communities and other affected communities. The need for standards on labor rights and on-the-job safety, which includes things like child labor, forced labor, discrimination, the right to organize a union, the right to collective bargaining, the need for standards to advance environmental protections. So that includes measures aimed at reducing the harms caused by mining, and also those needed to minimize the greenhouse gas emissions and other pollution associated with minerals processing, which, as we just heard, can be extremely energy intensive. I mean, the data that Krista showed about, all these coal-fired power plants just going into critical minerals, processing in Indonesia is so extreme, and that's something we need to be addressing too. And then finally, we talked about standards on ownership transparency and general supply chain transparency, so that any tax credits, any subsidies, any other commercial benefits within a CMA are actually targeted to support actors who follow the standards being set. And then fourth, and extremely important, we know that standards are only worth the paper that they're written on if they're actually enforced. So we called for strong enforcement. It sounds obvious, but that should start with critical minerals agreements only moving forward with countries that are committed to enforcing the standards they agree to. From there should be, again, offers of technical assistance, financial assistance to help countries where that's needed. We understand developing countries don't have a lot of extra money lying around. They need help setting up, mining inspection regimes or whatnot. Let's help them with that. And then once those mechanisms are in place, there also need to be ongoing enforcement mechanisms so that people who say their rights have been violated, their labor rights, their environmental rights, their informed consent rights, that they have someplace where they can issue those complaints, have confidence that those complaints will be heard quickly and fairly, and where violations are found, see meaningful facility-specific penalties for violations applied in a manner that forces the companies benefiting from the rights violations to clean up their acts. We don't want like carpet bombing penalties punishing entire countries. We want targeted penalties that make the corporations that are profiting off of environmental abuses and labor rights abuses to really feel the brunt of those penalties, whether it be loss of access to subsidies, whether it be fines, whether it be actual import bans. Those are the types of things that are needed to get bad actors to actually clean up their acts. If they're not feeling the financial burden themselves from it, they don't care if other people are being punished. And then fifth and finally, of course, we want CMAs to be negotiated in a transparent and participatory manner. No more rigged trade deals for big corporations. No more rushed pacts like the Japan CMA. Let's bring the negotiations out of the shadows and ensure that anyone who has input into these agreements gets to share that input before the terms of the deals are set. So that, in a nutshell, is what we're advocating for. In terms of where things are headed from here, the administration rightfully took a lot of flack for its awful CMA with Japan. It was a rushed pact that allowed EV components to qualify for US tax credits without meeting any standards whatsoever. That was rightfully critiqued by members of Congress on both sides of the political spectrum, by labor unions, environmental groups, faith groups, other civil society organizations. And that blowback has slowed US negotiations on new CMAs with other countries. It slowed them, but it hasn't stopped them, right? Those talks are still happening, whether formally or informally. And that includes talks at the European Union, the United Kingdom, Norway, Indonesia, the Philippines, a larger block of African nations, and others. I'd be surprised if any of those deals were finalized before the election, but we very much need to use the time that we have to try to popularize our shared demands and make sure that they get incorporated before the second wave of CMAs starts to move forward. So I think Hillary's going to go over some action steps. I think we'll have some time for questions. I'm happy to take any. And then let me just close by saying I really appreciate everyone being here, taking the time to learn about this issue, and I look forward to working with you on it.
Thank you so much, Arthur. There are a lot of questions popping up in the Q&A in the chat. I want to start just by thanking Lynn for those suggestions on organizations. We are definitely in a space of kind of growing a coalition of interested groups on this issue. So really appreciate that. I also wanted to note for folks that have been asking that we are going to be sending a recording of this conversation out in our follow-up email. So you can keep an eye out for that. A question that I wanted to throw to Arthur and Krista first. Do you have ideas about sustainable mineral extraction in the United States, that how that could go that wouldn't be in conflict with Indigenous rights here?
I'm happy to take a first stab at that. It's a great question. And to start, I mean, let's just acknowledge that there are a lot of corporate interests and others who want to get their hands on critical minerals as cheaply and as quickly as possible, and who view developing countries as the place to do that, specifically because the environmental and labor standards overseas are often much weaker than they are here. So they don't like the types of standards we're proposing for critical minerals agreements because they see like free, prior, and informed consent, labor rights, environmental standards, and so on as things that could slow down and raise the cost of mineral extraction. Our view is that if people don't get a say on the types of industrial operations happening in their backyards, if they aren't benefiting from those operations as workers and community members, then, I mean, just first of all, that's fundamentally unjust. That's an expansion of neocolonialism, of exploitation. We should be against that, period. But then second of all, it also risks fracturing the political coalitions that are needed in the US and internationally, to keep getting more and more ambitious in how we tackle the climate crisis. To be blunt about it, like if people have been promised quality green jobs, they've been promised more equitable, sustainable development, and that needs to be part of the climate solution. It needs to be part of a just transition, all of that. And if it doesn't happen, fossil fuel companies are going to continue to very easily mobilize people against climate solutions. So there are a range of reasons why advancing labor, environmental, community consent, other standards internationally through CMAs is important. In direct answer to the question, yes, the standards in a CMA should also apply to US mining and US recovery and recycling operations too. That includes free, prior, and informed consent standards for Indigenous communities in the United States. I think as people in the so-called global North, like we should recognize that we often have a much better chance of establishing cleaner, better paying mining and recovery operations here than people in the global South do in their communities. But at the same time, Indigenous sovereignty is Indigenous sovereignty. Community consent is community consent. If proponents of a new project can't convince people that the benefits outweigh their risks, like that can't just be swept aside. I don't know, Krista, if you have other things to say on this.
Yeah, no, that was most of it. I guess the only thing I'd like to kind of additionally point out is that both in the US and around the world, a disproportionate amount of critical minerals are located on Indigenous peoples' traditional customary lands. There's a study that came out a couple of months ago that found that in the US, about 3/4 of nickel, lithium, and cobalt reserves, or maybe it's copper, excuse me, are located within 35 miles of reservation land. So just understanding too that this issue disproportionately impacts Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. And then again, like Arthur said, whether these projects are in the U.S. or elsewhere in the world, Indigenous peoples have a right to exercise their free, prior, informed consent. And the consent is an important part. That means you can go through this process, learn the information you need about a project, and then decide to say no. And communities should have that right.
Thank you both. Getting a lot of questions asking for your slides, Arthur. So we can talk about that. One question that came up and was kind of a thread through the chat conversation during both of your presentations. Are there examples of like sets of standards that we could just pull and somehow include in CMAs? I've heard a lot about the ILO. I've heard a little bit about IRMA in different places in this space. What are those kind of existing sets of standards that would be easy to pull out and just include somehow in CMAs?
Yeah, I'll just briefly, and then Arthur, go ahead. I think within the joint comment that many of our organizations signed, cited quite a few, in terms of Indigenous people's rights. ILO 169 is one that is, very commonly referenced. I think a big piece to include, with all these trade agreements is understanding like that in many cases, the regulatory environment in the United States around environmental protection is much stronger than in some of these countries that are, advocating for these CMAs. So, also pushing for, I would say, best practices in terms of in international best practices on labor rights, on environmental rights within this sector.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Krista said, we'll send around the joint comments that list specific, standards in each of these areas that we recommend be adopted. I'll say, in my experience working on trade policy, we've gone the furthest in labor standards, but there are a lot of standards out there on free, prior, and informed consent, and certainly a lot of environmental standards that we can point to as well and do in that joint submission.
Awesome, super helpful. I thought this was a really good question. I don't know, Arthur and Krista, if you'll have the answers to it, but you might have some ideas. Are there measures that could be included in some kind of thinking around CMAs about the social cost of mineral extraction? I'm familiar like with ideas about like the triple bottom line, something like that. Is there any kind of like social cost of mining measure that could be included in some way?
I think having really strong provisions around, upholding human rights, upholding workers' rights, is really key to these provisions. If we have these weak CMAs that, do nothing to ensure that, people are not benefiting from these projects, then we're going to have the same types of abuses happening that, I talked about. So I think having, like very strong provisions around the ways that these projects impact people and, ways that projects are expected to prevent those abuses from happening.
Anything to add, Arthur?
Nope.
Cool. Another question that was kind of like threaded through the chat conversation while you were presenting, just around recycling of minerals. And I was wondering, I know Arthur, you touched on it a little bit, but if either of you could give us a little bit more information about the different processes for recycling, which minerals are we doing a good job recycling or not a good job recycling, if either of you feel comfortable speaking to it.
I think Krista could probably get into a lot more detail than I can. I'll just point out the basic concepts that I mean, probably everyone here is logged in through a computer or a cell phone. Those have critical minerals in them. Any sort of modern vehicle nowadays has critical minerals in them. We need to be really conscious in terms of making sure that we are recovering, refurbishing, reusing, and recycling as much of those as humanly possible, while also looking at, reduction needs. I mean, does every suburban household need a monster truck? Can they have a smaller vehicle? Can they have public transportation and mass transport? Like, these are questions that need to be asked and answered and incorporated into, agreements that are supposed to be about securing, resilient, reliable supply chains. I think Krista can better answer where we're doing a better job than others, maybe.
Yeah, I'll do my best. I'm not I could talk about plaster recycling all day, but maybe not so much battery. But I mean, just for context, in terms of like how much of these minerals we need. So an average electric vehicle uses over 80 pounds of nickel. That is just nickel in the battery in each electric vehicle. So when you're thinking about, how much electric vehicles weigh, we know they weigh a lot more than traditional combustion engine vehicles. It's because the batteries are so heavy. So we're talking about a lot of minerals. The good thing about a lot of the minerals, and I saw someone posted about aluminum in the chat, is that many of them could be essentially recycled in numerous times. That it's not they're not like single-use plastics where you use it once and you can't really recycle it because of the quality, where you can continuously recycle copper and recycle nickel. So it's also about having the infrastructure and creating the systems where it's actually more cost effective to recycle it than it is to mine raw minerals each time.
Thank you
And
both.
just to put, yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
Hillary, just to add in, just to really clarify, like these agreements are about where subsidies going, right? What things is the government going to prioritize in these supply chains? It just can't only be about mining. There should be a section about mining, but there need to be these other sections too.
Awesome. I think this is going to be our last one, but one more question. Do investors in the critical mineral supply chain have a role to ensure that these standards are included? Are the companies involved in ensuring that any of these standards are included, or is that not part of the conversation at this point?
I mean, I would say, there are two sort of investors. There are the corporate investors and then there are the government investors. What we're calling for in CMAs holds both the governments and the individual corporations to account, right? We're saying there need to be binding obligations for governments to do X, Y, and Z, and then there needs to be an enforcement mechanism that allows people whose rights are violated to go after these individual corporations. I mean, this is one of the innovations, the the positives in trade agreements that don't always exist in other international agreements, be it environmental treaties, peace treaties, human rights treaties. Trade agreements tend to have built-in enforcement mechanisms. You can apply penalties very, very easily in a trade agreement by saying, hey, that that good can't enter the country freely anymore. So we want to see the penalties, the enforcement mechanisms targeted at individual companies that are, violating labor rights, violating environmental rights, violating informed consent rights. And that we believe is the best way to get them to change their behavior and start doing the right thing. There's been progress in this area on labor rights within the US-Mexico-Canada agreement in recent years, and we need to keep building off of that base.
Krista, do you have anything to add?
No, that was great.
Awesome. So I think that for now, we're going to leave Q&A there. I want to thank Arthur and Krista so much for sharing about CMAs and sharing, Krista, about the report that Climate Rights International has done. I think this was a really good kind of base conversation about where we're headed with CMAs and what this conversation is going to look like in the coming months. So thank you both so much for presenting. I do want to turn now to a couple of actions that folks can take. I think, in all honesty, the biggest barrier to winning the kinds of standards that we've been talking about here that we really want to see in CMAs from an administration that has signaled support for some civil society demands in this area that activists across the country have been asking for, is that so many folks across the country haven't heard about CMAs yet, and they're not talking about it. So there's a couple things that everybody on this call can do to get the word out about CMAs in the coming weeks. First is that, as Arthur mentioned, Trade Justice and nearly 40 national organizations in the US and around the world submitted public comments to the US government, encouraging them to prioritize many of the things discussed here today in their CMA negotiations. So I have two asks in regard to those comments. The first is that folks read them and share them where appropriate to help get the word out about the civil society asks that we have in this area. And then the second ask is to please share Trade Justice's tweet on social media outlining the comments. I think that Clayton is going to put those links in the chat right now. The other thing that I wanted to raise here is that Trade Justice is gathering petition signatures calling on trade negotiators to prioritize labor rights, environmental standards, and Indigenous rights in their ongoing CMA negotiations. So I think, again, Clayton is going to drop that petition in the chat. Please sign it. Please also share it with activists, with organizations that you're working with. You can also share the petition on social media. I think Clayton is posting the link to the tweet in the chat as well. So, I think that, as Arthur outlined, there's probably going to be a lot more conversation and work to be done around CMAs in the coming months. There are several of these under consideration, but this first crucial step is just educating folks about the implications of these agreements, getting familiar with the asks, right? and sharing them with our networks and just making sure that environmental activists across the country are getting familiar with what CMAs are and what's at stake in these negotiations. I want to know for folks that are having a hard time copying or getting to links in the chat that I am going to be sharing a link to this recording of this call and several resources that have been mentioned in my follow-up email. So if you cannot access it here, do not worry. I will be sure that that ends up in your inbox probably sometime tomorrow. I want to give one more big thank you to Krista and to Arthur. Your comments have been really helpful today for framing this conversation and getting everybody up to speed on what's been going on with these negotiations. Like I said, I'll be in touch with folks that are attending in a follow-up email with the recording and the petition and the public comment and other resources that we've talked about today. Thank you so much. Have a great week, everyone, and we'll see some of you in June.